They said Helen Gillis was just a neighborhood girl with a crooked smile and a taste for trouble. But that's how most stories in the underworld begin. Quietly, in some ordinary corner of America, before the spark meets the gasoline. Helen was born in Chicago in 1911, into a city that never slept. The streets were loud with trolley bells, bootleg whiskey ran like water, and smoke from the steel mills rolled through every alley like ghosts looking for a fight. Her father was a hard-working man, Irish through and through, trying to keep his family straight in a city that rewarded the crooked. Helen grew up watching men in fedoras and long coats step into speakeasies, women with pearls and red lipstick laughing under the glow of street lamps. The city had a pulse, dangerous, magnetic, and she could feel it beat inside her from the very beginning. She was the kind of girl who didn't like rules. Teachers called her stubborn. Her friends called her brave. When other girls played dolls, Helen watched the boys gamble in the alleys and learned to read faces, who was bluffing, who was lying, and who was about to make a bad move. She had a sharp tongue, a quicker smile, and a temper that could turn a calm moment into a storm. Chicago toughened her early, and by the time she was 16, she was already used to the sound of sirens echoing through the night. Her neighborhood, North Side, was a patchwork of hope and crime. Every block had a story. The butcher who ran numbers for the mob, the bartender who served cops and crooks in the same breath, the priest who pretended not to see. In those days, morality was flexible and survival was an art. Helen didn't dream of being rich or famous. She dreamed of being free. Free from the grind, from the fear, from the dull ache of being ordinary. Then came the Great Depression, and the city changed overnight. Men lost their jobs, families lost their homes, and good people turned desperate. Helen saw it happen in real time. Neighbors selling everything they owned just to eat. Children begging on corners where gangsters once stood proud. It was a cruel joke. The world punished the honest and rewarded the bold. And Helen? She'd always had boldness in her blood. She started spending time with the wrong crowd. Or maybe it was the right one, depending on how you look at it. Nights at dance halls and roadhouses, smoky rooms filled with laughter that didn't sound entirely clean. There were whispers of names that carried weight. Dillinger, Capone, Nelson. They were like myth and menace rolled into one, living proof that the system could be beaten if you had enough guts and a gun. Helen didn't touch crime at first. She was more observer than participant, the girl leaning against the jukebox with a knowing grin. But she was drawn to that world like a moth to flame. The thrill, the danger, the way those men walked like the law didn't apply to them. It was intoxicating. She started dating small-time hustlers, men who made fast money and faster enemies. They gave her gifts, promises, and bruises she learned to hide with rouge. She didn't love them, not really. But each one brought her closer to the line between the world she knew and the one she wanted to touch. Then one night, in a crowded club filled with cigarette smoke and jazz, she met him, Lester Joseph Gillis, though most people would come to know him by a different name, Babyface Nelson. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like a man 10 feet high. Clean suit, restless eyes, and that dangerous charm that made you forget he was the kind of man you shouldn't trust. When he smiled at Helen, it wasn't soft or polite. It was like he already knew she'd follow him anywhere. She didn't stand a chance. At first, he treated her like a queen. Flowers, late-night drives, promises whispered between the city lights. But there was something in him, an energy, a fire, that scared and thrilled her at the same time. He was quick to laugh, quicker to rage. He didn't see the world as good or bad, just winners and losers. And Helen, maybe without realizing it, chose her side right then and there. Their love was reckless, wild, and doomed from the start. But Helen wasn't naive. She knew what kind of man he was. She saw the pistol he kept tucked under his jacket, the nervous way he watched every exit, the sudden disappearances that came with no explanation. Still, she didn't run. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was love. Or maybe she was already too deep in to remember what life looked like without the thrill of danger. By the time she was 21, Helen Gillis had gone from neighborhood girl to outlaw's wife. She'd married him, Babyface Nelson, and stepped across the invisible line between ordinary and infamous. Together they'd become legends. But legends don't live long in the world they built. She tried to keep her head down at first, telling herself she wasn't really part of it, that she could still hold on to some piece of her old self. But when your husband robs banks for breakfast, the law doesn't see the difference. Soon the papers started calling her the gun Moll, a phrase that made her sound glamorous and deadly at once, though in truth, Helen still cooked breakfast, still laughed with friends, still had moments when she wanted to go back. But you can't walk backward on a road paved with bullets. Chicago became too small, too hot. Every cop in the city wanted Nelson's head, and anyone connected to him was fair game. Helen learned to live on the move. New towns, new names, cheap motels, and a suitcase always half-packed. She became the calm in his chaos, the one steady thing in a life spinning faster every day. And somewhere in that madness, she stopped being the girl who watched from the sidelines. She became part of the story. There's a moment in every life when you make the choice that defines you. For Helen Gillis, that moment wasn't loud or dramatic. It came in a quiet breath, a simple decision to stay. She could have left. She could have walked away from the lies, the raids, the blood. But she didn't. She chose loyalty. She chose love. She chose him. And from that moment on, her fate was sealed. As the world around her sank deeper into crime and chaos, Helen wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was in the getaway car. She was hiding the guns. She was the last one to leave when things went bad. The newspapers would soon call her the gun Moll who wouldn't run. But for now, in this part of the story, she was just a young woman in love, standing at the edge of something dark and unstoppable, unaware that every road ahead led to the same place. Tragedy, infamy, and a name that history would never forget. They say every great crime story begins with a bad decision dressed up like romance. For Helen Gillis, that moment came on a warm Chicago night, when the music was loud enough to drown out conscience and the whiskey was cheap enough to taste like courage. The place was a club on the city's north side, a dim, smoky room pulsing with the rhythm of jazz and desperation. Men in sharp suits leaned on the bar, talking fast and watching faster. Women danced in dresses that caught the light like secrets. Somewhere in that haze of perfume and gun oil, Helen saw him, the man who'd rewrite her life. Lester Joseph Gillis wasn't a giant of a man. In fact, his nickname, Babyface, came from that youthful, clean look that made him seem almost innocent. But the truth was, behind that grin lived something mean, restless, and dangerous. He had a reputation already, whispered about in alleyways and speakeasies. People said he had a temper like a loaded pistol, small but deadly, and bound to go off if you pulled the trigger wrong. When he walked up to Helen, it wasn't with smooth words or polite charm. It was direct and like everything he ever did. "You dance as good as you look?" he asked, voice low, confident, reckless. Helen didn't answer right away. She just smiled, a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and said, "Try and find out." They danced until the floor was slick with sweat and cigarette ash, until the rest of the world faded into a blur. He smelled like tobacco and gasoline, his touch firm, his laugh quick. Helen didn't know if she was falling in love or just falling, but it didn't matter. She'd already made her choice. Lester, or Nelson, as his friends called him, wasn't some street punk. By the time he met Helen, he'd already done time in reform school and a stretch in jail. He was ambitious, clever, and meaner than he looked. While most men his age were hunting jobs, he was hunting opportunity, the kind that came from the end of a barrel. Helen didn't flinch when he talked about his life. Where most women saw danger, she saw freedom. He wasn't bound by the rules that trapped everyone else. He made his own. And that wildness, that fearless defiance, drew her closer than any promise of safety ever could. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Days blurred into nights spent riding through the city in stolen cars, the wind whipping her hair as he grinned behind the wheel. He'd tell her stories about the jobs he'd pulled, small banks, gas stations, payroll offices, the kind of scores that barely made the papers but paid enough to keep them fed and dressed. He told them like jokes, full of laughter and bravado. But behind the humor was something darker. Helen could sense it. She just didn't care. When she looked at him, she didn't see a criminal. She saw a man the world had underestimated, just like her. In 1930, they married in a small ceremony that felt more like a pact than a celebration. No white dress, no flowers, just two people promising to stand together, no matter what came. And what came next was a storm. The country was deep in the Great Depression. Banks were closing, families were starving, and faith in the system was dying fast. Men like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson became folk heroes to some. Outlaws who robbed the institutions that had robbed everyone else. To the poor, they were symbols of rebellion. To the law, they were enemies of the state. Nelson started working with small gangs at first, pulling quick jobs and disappearing into the night. He was smart too, never stayed in one place long, never trusted anyone too much. But his temper was his weakness. The smallest insult could turn him violent. Helen saw it more than once. The sudden switch in his eyes, the smile vanishing, the rage taking over. Still she stayed. Because when it was just the two of them, away from the chaos, away from the chase, he could be tender. He'd talk about wanting a home, a family, a future. He'd trace the lines of her hand and tell her he saw forever there. It was enough to make her believe that maybe, somehow, they could outrun the world. But the world always catches up. By 1933, Nelson's name was on the radar of every federal agent in the Midwest. He joined up with Dillinger's crew, the most infamous gang in America. Together, they tore through banks from Indiana to South Dakota, leaving a trail of bodies, headlines, and fear. Helen traveled with him, living out of motels and safe houses, her life shrinking to the size of whatever bag she could carry. She became his shadow, the one who kept the engine running, who patched him up when the bullets got too close, who never asked questions even when the answers were written in blood. There were nights she'd wake to the sound of gunfire in her dreams, only to realize it wasn't a dream at all. The real world was worse. Cops on the move, gunshots cracking through the dark, screams and sirens and the smell of burning rubber. She'd grab what she could, follow Nelson out the door, and keep running. Always running, yet through it all they laughed. They fought. They made love like the world might end the next day, because sometimes it almost did. The newspapers called her the Gangsters' Moll, as if she were just decoration. But the truth was, she was tougher than most of the men chasing them. When bullets started flying, she didn't hide. She reloaded. She wasn't just the girl in the passenger seat. She was his partner in every sense. The longer it went on, the more dangerous Nelson became. His crimes grew bolder, his anger more unpredictable. FBI agents started calling him the most violent man in America. Not because of the money he stole, but because of the fury he carried. Helen saw it too. There were moments when he'd sit in silence, hands shaking, eyes distant. Like the violence was a weight he couldn't set down. Once, after a shootout that left 2 policemen dead, Helen begged him to stop. "We could disappear," she whispered. "Find a place where they'll never look." He looked at her with a sad sort of smile and said, "They'll always look, doll." That's what happens when you don't play by their rules. She knew he was right. And she knew she'd never leave him. There's a kind of love that burns too bright, beautiful but doomed. Helen and Nelson had that kind of love. Theirs wasn't built on trust or peace. It was built on adrenaline, on the rush of danger, on the belief that if they faced the world together, they could beat it. By late 1934, they were among the most wanted in America. Dillinger was dead. The Bureau was tightening its noose. Nelson was becoming more reckless by the day, as if he knew the end was close and wanted to meet it head-on. Helen tried to keep him calm, but you can't stop a man who's made peace with his own destruction. Still, she stayed. Through the raids, the gunfights, the long nights on the road, she never left his side. That's what made her different. Most gun malls ran when the heat came. But Helen, she faced it with him, because in her eyes, love wasn't something you walked away from when the bullets started flying. It was something you fought for, even when it killed you. And as the walls began to close in on Babyface Nelson, Helen Gillis stood ready, not as a victim, but as the only person who truly understood the man behind the myth. By the time 1934 rolled around, Helen and Lester Gillis were ghosts in motion, drifting through America like smoke from a gun that never stopped firing. The newspapers called him Babyface Nelson, but the name didn't match the man anymore. The baby-faced kid with the sly grin had hardened into something else entirely. His eyes were colder now, sharper, like a man who'd seen too much and stopped believing in mercy. For Helen, every sunrise felt like stolen time. She never knew which day would be their last, but she lived each one as if the world might end by nightfall. Theirs was a life of motels and safe houses, of dirt roads and close calls, and through it all, she stayed beside him, loyal, steady, unflinching, even as the line between love and survival blurred into one. After Dillinger's death in July of 1934, the criminal underworld was in chaos. The feds were out for blood, and Nelson knew it. He'd become their new obsession, the small man with the big gun and the bigger temper. He wasn't content to hide. He wanted to fight back, and that made him more dangerous than ever. Helen remembered the night it changed. They were holed up in a cabin near Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The moonlight cut through the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and gun oil. Nelson sat by the table, cleaning his Thompson submachine gun, while Helen folded the last of their clothes into a suitcase. She could feel the tension rolling off him, the restless energy that came before something bad. "They think they can scare me," he muttered, eyes fixed on the weapon in his lap. "They think they can hunt me down like I'm some kind of animal." Helen looked up, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's time to stop fighting, Lester. We could disappear, change our names again, go west." He glanced at her, and for a split second she saw the man she fell in love with, the smile that used to make her heart skip. But then it was gone, replaced by that fire again. "You don't get it, doll. Once they put your face on those posters, there's no going back. You run till you drop, or you stand your ground." That was the moment she knew. He'd never stop running, but he'd never surrender either. And she wasn't about to leave him behind. They moved constantly after that. 1 week in Minnesota, the next in Iowa, then back through Illinois. The country was shrinking around them, every road a risk, every stranger a potential informant. Helen learned to pack in minutes, to read danger in a man's eyes before he spoke, to sleep with one ear open for the sound of car engines outside. She was only 23, but she'd lived a lifetime's worth of fear and fire. There were moments, fleeting ones, when they tried to pretend they were normal. A quiet breakfast in a diner where no one recognized them. A drive through open farmland with the windows rolled down and the wind in their faces. For a few miles they could almost believe they were just another young couple in love. But the illusion never lasted long. It never does when your names are written in the FBI's most wanted files. Then came Sioux Falls. It was supposed to be a simple bank job, quick in, quick out. But nothing stayed simple with Nelson. He wanted to make a statement, to remind the world he was still out there. The robbery went bad fast. A guard resisted. Nelson opened fire. When the dust settled, 2 men were dead and half the town was talking. That was the moment the Bureau made it personal. Edgar Hoover had a new public enemy #1, and his name was Babyface Nelson. Posters with his face went up across the country. Radio bulletins warned the public to stay away, and every cop, agent, and bounty hunter west of Chicago wanted the bounty that came with his capture. For Helen, it was a nightmare made real. They couldn't go anywhere without seeing his face staring back at them, in diners and gas stations, even in the papers she bought just to check how close the law was. Still, Nelson laughed it off. "They can print what they want," he said. "They ain't catching me." But Helen could feel the pressure building. The days grew shorter, the silences longer. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the twitch in his hands, the short temper, the sleepless nights spent pacing by the window. The fire that once made him unstoppable was now burning him alive. And still, she loved him. God help her, she loved him. One night, as they hid out in a run-down farmhouse in Illinois, Helen sat beside him as he stared out into the dark. "You ever wonder what it's all for?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "You mean all the shooting and running?" She nodded. He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating the hard lines of his face. "I don't think about it, doll. Thinking gets you killed." She turned away, her heart heavy. She'd once believed they were running toward something, freedom, fortune, maybe even peace. Now she knew they were just running from the inevitable. The Bureau finally caught up with them that autumn. Nelson had killed 2 federal agents near Barrington, and now the manhunt was relentless. Every town had eyes. Every roadblock was a trap. They'd become America's most wanted couple, living proof that crime didn't pay, but love sure made you stick around for the punishment. Through it all, Helen refused to abandon him. When he was wounded in a shootout near Wisconsin, she helped him into the car, her hands slick with his blood, her heart pounding in her throat. "Hold on, Lester," she whispered, pressing a cloth to the wound. "We'll make it. We always do." He gave her that same grin he'd worn the night they met, even as the life drained out of him. "You're one hell of a girl, Helen." She didn't cry. Not then. There wasn't time. They found refuge in a friend's hideout, a quiet cabin tucked away from the main road. Nelson was weak, feverish, his strength fading fast. Helen stayed by his side, wiping his brow, feeding him spoonfuls of water, whispering stories about the places they'd go once this was all over. She knew he didn't believe it, neither did she. But she said it anyway, because love isn't about truth. It's about holding on to lies that make the pain bearable. For a brief moment, as dawn crept through the window, he reached for her hand. "You could still run," he murmured. "You should." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Not without you." And that was the truth of Helen Gillis, the woman who wouldn't run. She stayed through every siren, every storm, every drop of blood spilled on the road they'd chosen together. Because to her, loyalty wasn't a choice. It was destiny. Soon, the world would remember the end, the infamous shootout at Barrington, the fiery death that made headlines across the nation. But for now, in this chapter, it was just two outlaws on the run, a man too wild to be tamed and a woman too faithful to walk away. By late November of 1934, the air in Illinois carried that sharp winter bite that smelled of smoke and endings. The leaves were gone, the fields were bare, and the manhunt for babyface Nelson had reached its fever pitch. Helen knew it. She could feel it in her bones, the way an old wound aches before a storm. Every road they took felt narrower, every face they passed a little too curious. The world had closed its doors on them. They were exhausted, both of them. Months of running, sleeping in cold cabins, stealing cars, hiding from shadows that wore badges. Helen's eyes had learned to scan every mirror, every roadside diner window for a reflection that didn't belong. And Nelson, her Lester, was wearing down too. His anger had become quieter, colder, a kind of smoldering rage that never went out. The newspapers called him a monster now. Public enemy number one, the most violent man in America. But Helen still saw the man she loved. Broken maybe, cornered definitely, but still hers. They'd been hiding in a safe house near Chicago, moving only at night. A friend, John Paul Chase, was with them now, a loyal associate who'd helped Nelson pull a few jobs in the past. Chase was jittery, constantly watching the window, whispering about how the feds were getting too close. Nelson laughed it off, but Helen noticed the way his hand lingered near his pistol more often. Even he could feel it. Something was closing in. On the morning of November 27, 1934, they packed up to move again. Helen wrapped her coat tighter around her as they stepped into the bitter wind. Nelson climbed into the front seat of a stolen Ford V8, Chase behind the wheel. Helen sat in the back, the hum of the engine vibrating through her spine as they headed north. The sun was just beginning to rise over the frozen landscape, pale and distant, like it wanted no part in what was coming. For hours the road stretched quiet and empty. Then just outside of Barrington, Helen saw it. A dark car in the distance, parked at an angle near a curve in the road. Another vehicle sat behind it, both engines idling. Her stomach tightened. "Lester," she whispered. He saw it too. The glint of metal, the faint shape of men stepping out, rifles in hand. "Feds," he muttered. His voice didn't shake. It never did. Before Helen could breathe, Nelson barked, "Floor it!" Chase slammed his foot down and the Ford roared to life. Bullets erupted almost instantly, sharp cracking echoes bouncing through the cold morning air. Glass shattered. Helen ducked low, the world exploding into chaos. Nelson leaned out the passenger window, his Tommy gun spitting fire. The sound was deafening, the recoil jarring his whole body. "Hold it steady," he yelled, voice half lost in the storm of noise. Helen could see the agents, Herman Hollis and Samuel Cowley, crouching behind their car, returning fire with deadly precision. The Ford swerved hard as bullets tore through the hood. Chase cursed, gripping the wheel tighter. One round grazed Helen's shoulder. hot pain slicing through her coat, but she didn't scream. She just pressed her hand against it, eyes fixed on Nelson. He was in his element. Wild, furious, alive. His face was set, his jaw clenched, every motion deliberate. To him, this wasn't fear. This was defiance. This was his way of saying he'd die on his own terms. The Ford screeched to a halt as the tires blew out. They were pinned now, smoke pouring from the engine. Nelson kicked open the door and stepped out, gun in hand, shouting at the agents as if daring them to come closer. The world slowed in that moment, the wind whipping across the road, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, the cold sun glinting off the barrel of his Thompson. Then came the final volley. A burst of fire from the agents' rifles caught Nelson square in the chest. He stumbled back, still firing as his knees buckled. Hollis and Cowley went down too, the price of facing a man who refused to surrender. Helen screamed his name, rushing forward, bullets whizzing past her as she dragged him toward the car. His blood soaked through her hands, hot and steady. "Stay with me, Lester. Please stay with me." He tried to grin even then. "Told you. They'd have to. Kill me first," he gasped. Helen and Chase somehow got him back inside. The Ford's engine coughed, then roared weakly as Chase forced it forward. Helen pressed her scarf against Nelson's wound, her breath fogging in the cold. The blood wouldn't stop. It ran between her fingers, dark and endless. "You'll be all right," she whispered. "You always are," Nelson coughed, his voice hoarse. You still got that picture of us?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small photograph, worn at the edges, of them standing together outside a roadhouse months earlier. She held it up so he could see. His eyes softened for just a moment. "Keep it," he murmured. "So you remember. I didn't run. They drove through the back roads, trying to outrun the inevitable. The world outside blurred. Fields, trees, snow, a smear of gray and white. Helen kept her eyes on him the whole time, whispering anything she could to keep him awake. But somewhere near Nile's center, his breathing slowed. The fire that had kept him alive, the fury, the pride, the unbreakable will, began to fade. His hand found hers, trembling. "Don't let them—" His words trailed off, lost in the hum of the dying engine. Then silence. Helen didn't cry right away. She just sat there staring at the man who'd once been the loudest thing in her world. For a moment it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The outlaw who'd laughed in the face of death had finally met it head-on, and the world felt smaller without him. Chase pulled over at a roadside hideout, the house of a friend who owed them a favor. They carried Nelson inside, laying him on a bed. Helen covered him with a blanket, even though he'd never feel the warmth again. She brushed his hair back, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "You got your wish, Lester. You didn't run." That night, the news spread like wildfire. Babyface Nelson killed in Barrington gun battle. The headlines called it a victory for law enforcement, a warning to all criminals. But for Helen, it was the end of everything she'd ever known. When the agents finally found her days later, she didn't fight. She didn't cry. She simply told them where they could find his body, already buried quietly by friends who still honored his name. They called her the Gangster's wife, the last gun Moll, but none of those titles meant anything to her. She wasn't a headline. She was just a woman who'd loved a man the world refused to forgive. In the days that followed, as she sat alone in a jail cell, Helen replayed that last day in her mind, the smoke, the gunfire, the look in his eyes when he fell, and through it all, one truth burned steady. She'd never run. Not from him. Not from what they'd been. The world would move on, the papers would fade. But the story of that cold November day at Barrington would live forever. The tale of the outlaw who met death on his own terms, and the woman who stayed to see him through it. They say the story ended on that cold November road in Barrington, with gunfire echoing off the trees and smoke curling into the gray sky. But for Helen Gillis, the story didn't end there. It just changed shape. The gunfire stopped, but the silence that followed was louder than any bullet she'd ever heard. When they finally caught her, she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't try to explain. She'd spent too many years running, too many nights looking over her shoulder to think there was any escape left. The FBI found her hiding near Chicago, worn down and hollow-eyed, her coat still stained with the blood of the man she loved. When they asked her why she hadn't run, why she hadn't left him when the world turned against them. She gave them the same answer she'd always believed. I don't run from the people I love. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. They called her the gun moll who wouldn't run. And though the newspapers meant it as something sharp and scandalous, the phrase became her legend. She was 23 years old, barely more than a girl, yet she carried herself with the kind of quiet that comes only from someone who's lived too fast for too long. In the courtroom, she was calm. No tears, no hysterics, no pleas for mercy. The reporters watched her, waiting for cracks, for the moment the outlaw's widow would break. But Helen didn't give them the satisfaction. She'd already lost everything that mattered. What else could they take? When they read the charges, harboring a criminal, aiding and abetting, accessory after the fact, she listened without blinking. When the sentence came, a year in prison, she nodded once, as if she'd already served the real punishment. Inside the women's prison at Milan, Michigan, the walls were gray, and the air always smelled faintly of bleach and regret. But Helen wasn't like the others. She didn't brag about her crimes, didn't pick fights, didn't complain. She spent her days in silence, folding laundry or sitting by the window, watching the world go on without her. Sometimes, when the guards weren't looking, she'd pull out a small, creased photograph from her pocket, the one of her and Nelson smiling by the car, taken before the manhunt began. It was fading now, but it was all she had left of him. One of the older inmates once asked her, "You ever wish you'd left him when you had the chance?" Helen didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, her eyes soft and distant. "No," she said finally. "He was my choice. You don't get to wish away your choices." When her sentence ended, Helen walked out of prison into a world that no longer remembered her face. The papers had moved on to new stories, new gangsters, new crimes, new chaos. The age of the outlaw had burned bright and died fast, leaving behind only names in books and headlines. Dillinger, Floyd, Nelson, and somewhere between those ghosts, Helen Gillis, the woman who stayed. She returned quietly to Chicago, keeping to the shadows of a city that once knew her name. The speakeasies were gone now, replaced by legal bars and tired songs. The world was healing from its madness, but she carried her scars in silence. For years, she lived a modest life, working small jobs, raising her children, staying out of trouble. No one looking at her would have guessed she'd once stood beside America's most wanted man, that she'd ridden through gunfire and watched the life fade from his eyes. But every so often, someone older would catch her name and pause. "Gillis? Any relation to that Nelson fella?" And she'd smile faintly, the kind of smile that hides more than it tells. "Maybe once," she'd say. Time didn't erase the story. It just softened it. To the world, she became a curiosity, a footnote in the gangster era, a woman defined by the man she loved. But to those who looked closer, her story was something else entirely. It was about loyalty in a world built on betrayal, about courage that didn't come from a gun, but from staying when everyone else would have run. And deep down, Helen never stopped seeing Lester the way she had that first night. The boyish grin, the restless eyes, the spark that drew her in. She knew the world saw a killer, a criminal, a monster. But she saw the man who'd once danced with her under smoky lights, who'd promised her forever even when forever was measured in bullets. In her later years, she rarely spoke about him. When she did, it was with a calm, even voice, no excuses, no justifications. "He was what he was," she'd say, "and I was with him. That's the truth of it." There's something haunting in that kind of acceptance. Most people spend their lives trying to rewrite their past. Helen didn't bother. She carried it, like a locket she never took off. They buried her quietly when her time came. No fanfare, no reporters, no flashbulbs. Just a simple headstone under the gray Midwestern sky. But somewhere out there, the legend of Helen Gillis still lingers. In the yellowed pages of crime archives, in whispered stories told by those who love old outlaw tales. Because she wasn't just a side character in someone else's legend. She was the proof that loyalty has a cost, and some people are willing to pay it in full. Even decades later, when historians and writers tried to piece together who she really was, they couldn't quite pin her down. Was she a victim of love, blinded by charm and violence? Or was she a willing partner, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who fought the whole world? Maybe she was both, and maybe that's what makes her story unforgettable. Helen Gillis wasn't a saint, but she wasn't the villain they made her out to be either. She was something rarer, human, Flawed, passionate, stubbornly loyal in a time when loyalty could get you killed. In the end, her name faded from the headlines, but her spirit never left the story. When people talk about Babyface Nelson, they still mention her, the woman who never ran. Because behind every outlaw there's a shadow. And sometimes that shadow burns brighter than the man himself. Her story reminds us that love, real love, doesn't always look like roses and promises. Sometimes it looks like standing beside someone when the world turns its guns on you. Sometimes it means losing everything and staying anyway. Maybe that's why people still whisper her name. Because in a world where everyone runs from pain, Helen Gillis stood her ground. She stood beside a man the world called a monster and saw something worth saving. And though she couldn't save him, she saved his story by living it to the bitter end. And that's the strange beauty of her legacy. It isn't about crime or fame or even love in the romantic sense. It's about loyalty, about holding fast to something, someone, even when everything else tells you to let go. So when the historians close their books and the screens fade to black, her voice still lingers somewhere in the dark, soft, steady, unbroken. I didn't run, she says, and I never will. The story of Helen Gillis is more than just another gangster tale. It's a reminder that loyalty can be both our greatest strength and our deepest undoing. Some people are built to chase glory. Others are built to stand their ground, no matter what it costs. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history, stories of love, loyalty, and the outlaws who dared to live by their own rules.